And this student responded that he really wasn't in church. Or even before he could respond properly, Dr. Afflick said to him, "Oh, perhaps you were a bedside Baptist yesterday." He was that kind of an individual, very witty, quick on his feet, and is always able to evoke a laughter from those with whom he interacted. We honor him this evening as one who has served Jamaica Theological Seminary well, and we are honoring him with this memorial lecture. You will hear more about that lecture as it comes to us this evening. My prayer, my hope is that all of us who are here, we will find the presentation to be insightful, informative, and certainly inspiring. Inspiring because we are hoping it will prompt us to do good things, just like Dr. Afflick did during his own lifetime. Insightful as we seek to find our way in being the kinds of individuals shedding light on those around us, serving them as faithfully as God would have us to. Informative as we seek to be enlightened, as we seek to be informed, as we seek knowledge for application in the various ministries that we are called upon to be engaged. I pray that as our lecturer comes to us this evening, the information, the insights, the inspiration that comes will all be benefiting to all of us who are in this space this evening. Certainly, we are praying that the technology will serve us well. In spite of the glitches we had at the beginning, we're looking forward to a wonderful evening, even as we are sharing it with our collaborator and partner, Love FM 101. We're looking forward to you having this evening's presentation serving you well, and certainly allowing you to be informed as you have come in to share the time with us. I welcome you again and hope for a very wonderful evening together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, our president. Thank you so much for the warm greeting and for setting the framework for our lecture this evening, good morning, wherever you are. Once again, we welcome you to the Jamaica Theological Seminary lecture. Clive Afflick, Dr. Clive Afflick, was the first Jamaican principal, local principal of the Jamaica Theological Seminary. JTS started in the 1960s, and then by founder and first president, Dr. Venus Derry. In the 1980s, we had our first local principal, that of Dr. Clive Afflick. He served from 1984 to 1991. He was supported by his wonderful wife, Mrs. Peter Afflick. He was one of only two non-American lecturers at JTS in his first decade. He taught the courses hermeneutics, Bible study methods, Testament Greek grammar, and exegesis. That is why our lecture this afternoon and the annual Clive Afflick lecture normally centers on hermeneutics. And because Dr. Afflick is an avid interpreter of the scriptures, loved the book of James, and thought that it was the foundation for not only orthodoxy, right doctrine, but also orthopraxy, right practice. He was a man with a nurturing personality, foundational Jamaican lecturer at JTS. Somebody else said he had wit and congenial nature. Another person said he was an expression of genuine interest in people. His generous use of time in serving others is what one other member of the JTS family recalled. And finally, someone said his gentle demeanor in his interaction with his peers. A giant in terms of biblical scholarship and pastoral work. but a man who did not forget his roots and forget that what he did was for God and for God's people. He was very instrumental in cementing JTS's place within the fabric of higher education in Jamaica beyond its shores in the 1980s. And as an institution, we are who we are today because of the works of men like Dr. Afflick, his wife, and others who have invested significantly in the future and the continued growth of this noble institution. We want to talk about our lecturer for this evening, who will be tackling the issue of hermeneutic. I want to introduce to us the Right Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner. And I tell you something, when you meet him and talk with him, all those titles, you would not know that this man possessed all those titles because he does not wear it on his sleeve. Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner is a tutor in contextual theology. He's Deputy Director of Research at the Queen's Foundation, Birmingham. His most recent publication is Caribbean Contextual Theology, an Introduction, and it's the latest iteration of a Caribbean theological reflection. Dr. Turner also sits on both the Faith and Order Commission of the Church of England and the World Council of Churches. In the latter, he represents the Caribbean. He is a Bahamian, just up north from Jamaica there. He's a Bahamian Anglican priest. He specializes in contextual and practical theology, particularly in the intersections between faith and culture in the African Caribbean context. Dr. Turner has a rich publication history and travels as an international Caribbeanist scholar, lecturing on decoloniality, hermeneutics, and contextual and practical theological themes as they relate to Black and non-Western indigenous experiences. In other words, Dr. Turner is of the view that we should decolonize the African Caribbean community from the imperial darts and daggers that have been imposed upon our hermeneutics, our biblical practices, and so forth. Dr. Turner is currently carrying out research into racism. Church of England as part of a cross-training in psychology and theology fellowship through the University of Birmingham. Listeners, those who are gathered around your devices, radio listeners as well, please welcome the Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. I trust you can hear me well. If you can hear me well, please give me a thumbs up. And I pray that the sound continues to cooperate. Cool. I wish to thank the Jamaican Theological Seminary, Dr. Thompson and team for this invitation. And I come with respect and admiration, really, for the legacies of resistance in Jamaican society in particular, and in the Jamaican psyche, as I see it. And it's an honor to give the lecture in honor of such an auspicious theologian and an educator, a pioneer. And we have had so many great Caribbean people, men and women, who have invested in the region. And I just want to salute all of you and Dr. Afflick. I'll share my screen and pretty much go through the material I have for you. And everything is there. Hopefully it helps you as best as I can, not just what I say, but what you can see. Let me begin with some key questions that I think are crucial when we think about hermeneutics in the African Caribbean, things that lie at the heart. For me, the first question is, what kinds of Christianity do we inhabit? Do they truly affirm who we are as Black people, as Caribbean people in all our complexity? In 2024, October, I did the Sam Sharp lecture at the Queen's Foundation in Birmingham, here in the UK. And that was the essential question I asked. Secondly, who or what has determined how we interpret scripture and everyday life? Who gets to determine how we think about what we think about? That's a fundamental question that often we don't ask. And thirdly, what example do we have of ways of interpretation that have been deeply biblical and Black affirming, but we just don't see it? I believe that the Caribbean as a region has much to teach the rest of the world. We have advanced thinking, academia, culture, the arts in ways that are truly breathtaking. We've produced Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, CLR James, Usain Bolt, Bob Marley, Shaggy, Sam Sharp, a whole host and mixture of persons across history. And all the world could do is stand back and watch. But what about our theology? What about our interpretive skills? What about our natural depth of discernment, of wisdom, of creativity, of co-vision, of double talk? What about our survival, of rising from the ashes? Time and time again, we see it all the time. It must take a lot of skill to do that. But can we see it? In this lecture, I want to talk about Caribbean theological hermeneutics in their various guises, but particularly how they have always tended towards wholeness and flourishing for Black and marginalized people. And I try to bring in as many Jamaican scholars as I can because you have a rich history in terms of intellectual thought and theological depth. Because in truth, the long legacies of resistance thinkers who have caused us to rethink the kinds of Christianity we inherited, a lot of them have come from your shores. I just hope that we can see it. So, at the heart of a Caribbean contextual theology, this is my thing that I go on about, is always a challenge. We have to challenge empire and colonialism using theological hermeneutics deeply influenced by not only the Christian scriptures, but our pro-African and pro-Caribbean realities. It has to be inclusive. It has to be African-centered, or whatever the indigenous makeup might be, identity affirming, justice seeking, and God expanding. God is bigger than what the missionary brought. And I can't say that enough. But I said some big words, so let me break down some of these. Hermeneutics and decoloniality. It's important to establish what we mean by hermeneutics or decolonial or anti-colonial. And by hermeneutics, we simply mean the way we interpret texts, the way they are interpreted or factors involved in the interpretive exercise. Paying attention to how texts are interpreted, particularly biblical texts, is crucial within the Caribbean region, where the Bible has been used in multiple ways, either for perpetuating violence and oppression or for resisting the same. And the term anti-colonial is more of an earlier term associated with thinkers like Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Walter Rodney, amongst others. Anti suggests a counter or a direct contradiction to the colonial agenda with its anti-African hermeneutics. For example, César coined the phrase negritude and tried to champion a counter to the Black hatred that's inherent in colonialism. For him, colonizers were not innocent, but barbarous and pathologically violent. Joan Marcus Garvey, for him, the solution for diasporan Black people in the Americas is to return to Mother Africa, to live out a counter history, spirituality, culture, political and economic system than what was provided in racist Euro-American world order as he saw it. This is hermeneutics in action. And decolonial and post-colonial are more contemporary terms that highlight the complex dialectical relationship between the colonizer and the colonized in colonial situations. They seek to explore the substructures, how this thing works, its language, its psychology, its philosophy, its theology, all of its assumptions. So when we come to the region, we are often conflated with and confused with the Latin American context. And it's common to think of liberation theology coming out of Latin America as the thing. But I want to suggest that theologies of liberation appear across the globe. So in thinkers like Gutierrez, Leonardo and Clodovis Boff, John Sobrino, they come out of their context, but Caribbean people and thinkers been doing this long time and dying for it and struggling for it and seeing through the mask. For we have been seeing that the church in its many guises has been often deeply complicit in the practice of injustice. However, when we come to the region, it's not fair to say that liberation theology belongs only to Latin America. I could say that all day. But legacies of reading the Bible through the lens and framework of liberation has been crucial in our context. So you have examples in the African Caribbean, powerful ones, Sam Shah, Nani of the Maroons, Nat Turner. We think of the development of Black theologies in the United States, in South Africa, in the UK, Black theologies of liberation across the globe. People like James Cone, Steve Biko, Anthony Reddy, Robert Beckford, and even persons who are here on this Zoom, perhaps. And there's a consistent attention to the sin of racism, deeply embedded in Western society generally. But how do you begin to tease this thing out? We have had movements that have furthered this on, womanist theologians who have consistently argued that even in movements of liberation, the work continues. Women of color have been oppressed and marginalized consistently. The sisters need to be heard, but we don't give them enough attention. So let's think more about the Caribbean context. You more than likely know Oral Thomas, and I will get to Oral in a second. I'm sure he's very much known to JTS and a scholar renowned in our world. The Caribbean has a rich and developed decolonial or post-colonial tradition outside of theology that must be considered before surveying some of the Caribbean theological works. So the French Caribbean has produced some thinkers like the Martinicans, Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, who have looked at in different ways the psychology and the political structure of colonialism. Perhaps Fanon has been the most enduring thinker for the French-speaking Caribbean and the rest of us, and even globally with his two famous books, Black Skin, White Mask and Wretched of the Earth. Fanon considers the colonial system as a totalizing situation that is undergirded by violence and should be read as such. Experiencing the inherent racism in the French Caribbean, in France, and in Algeria, he concludes, this is a statement he makes, as long as he remains among his own people, the little black follows very nearly the same course as the little white, but if he goes to Europe, he will have to reappraise his lot. For the Negro in France, which is his country, will feel different from other people. One can hear the glib remark, the Negro makes himself inferior, but the truth is that he is made inferior. I wrote an article some time back in Modern Theology, and I'm interested in psychology and its intersections with theology. But I make this statement that what we see in Fanon is a diversity of tools. This is the hermeneutical bit with which to view coloniality. Hence, there are different ways to read and interpret Fanon himself. On the one hand, he can be seen as a political, anti-colonial activist and theorist. It is often the case that he is seen as a freedom fighter. But this sidelines the other way in which we need to read him, as a post-colonial theorist of the specifically psychological dimensions of the colonial situation. He describes the unseen psychological, social, and religious dimensions of this violence within colonialism without compartmentalizing these different aspects. In other words, he's trying to get us to read through this thing. And this thing is toxic. And this thing is violent. And this thing is destructive. And this thing is pervasive and everyday. You would know and be proud of Sylvia Wynter as another name that deserves attention. Her academic output as a philosopher, anti-colonial thinker, dramatist, novelist covers the Caribbean, Latin America, Spanish history, and insights. And she's published. And we can't esteem her enough. But Winters is one of those earlier thinkers exploring and exposing the substructures of the kind of systems we live in, how it's perpetuated. And you have to be able to read it and read it deeply. Another person we have is Walter Rodney, whose How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is a work that has inspired many political thinkers since his assassination in his native land in Guyana in 1980. I don't want us to forget these people who have shaped my thinking and no doubt our thinking, and they are important to help us to read the situations and systems we live in. Now, thinking about the Caribbean context, theological thinking in the region, including formal theological works, inevitably stem from this kind of anti-imperial critique. Long before the publication of Noel Erskine's Decolonizing Theology, Sam Sharp was touring various Jamaican plantations, preaching and teaching a kind of gospel that led to slaves fighting for their lives and freedom in the Christmas Day riots, the Baptist War, 1831 to 1832. And deeply influenced by Afro cultures in the Atlantic world, including the Caribbean, you have persons like Robert Hood, who asks in his book, something that shaped my thinking early on, must God remain Greek? What kind of God do we serve? What kind of Christianity? We back to this question. This book argues that the Greco-Roman framework that informs our Europeanized Christianity in the West continues to shape our thought forms as Black people, often in Afrophobic ways. Here's what he writes. The crucial question for the worldwide Christian church as it tries to take seriously third world cultures, particularly those in Africa and in the African diaspora and in the Caribbean, is whether Greek metaphysics will continue to be used as a filter to authenticate its claims and understanding of God and Jesus Christ. For the third world cultures in Africa and the Caribbean, must God remain Greek? Your own Noel Erskine makes this statement. In an attempt to relate Caribbean spirituality to other third world experiences, the point of departure for reflection on the Caribbean experience will be my own background within the church in Jamaica. My knowledge of theological education and life as a pastor in the church in Jamaica indicated that theology, as it was practiced within the church, did not address the identity problem that slavery created among Caribbean peoples. God, as presented within the Caribbean church, was often on the symbol of freedom, but rather the extension of the European and North American church experience. Now we come to Oral Thomas. He specifically, his PhD and his work is specifically on Caribbean theological hermeneutics. Thomas argues that the biblical reading strategies often employed in the Caribbean still conform to literary rhetorical models that prioritize the social world of the biblical text with little regard for transformation of the present context of the reader. And for those who may have been doing biblical studies, you understand that language and those methods in biblical studies. For those who might not, please forgive me, but look up socio-literary and rhetorical models, and you will get the point. But he argues for a biblical resistance strategy that takes both the Caribbean context and that of the biblical world seriously. This is what he says. A resistant reading strategy necessitates giving self-conscious attention to the world of interests of practices in which the text was produced, behind the text, the writer's vision of reality on the text, and the influences and experience that shape the reader's interpretation in front of the text, or the particularities and peculiarities of the context of the interpreter. Both the production and reading of the biblical text are modes of social action. It is out of these modes of social action in which all three hermeneutical moves are involved. Thomas maintains his commitment to an interdisciplinary post-colonial and decolonial tradition. With his engagement with the scholarship of people like Sugita Raja, Mosala, and Gerald West. And these thinkers from the global South challenge us to read the Bible otherwise. You cannot simply read it as if it's some inherited thing that cannot change. We have changed, insights have changed, understandings have changed, and we cannot read the Bible from the standpoint of somebody else, some other culture. Why can't we read it from our own standpoint? Through these insights, hermeneutics begin to challenge colonial narratives that have shaped the received understandings of biblical texts, the ideological framing of texts in their reception, unearth the social, gender, class, and social practices of the text, and ultimately expose power dynamics involved in how the text is interpreted in the first place. Thomas explores historical examples of this in the writings of Sam Shaw, Paul Bogle, Marcus Garvey, revolutionary freedom fighters in Jamaica in their respective historical time periods. Their agitation was informed by a deep understanding of a God of justice who suffers and cares about the plight of his people. And the same central approach to reading and understanding scripture is also traced in the tradition of the Rastafari and in historical figures such as Philip Porter. And interestingly, Thomas also looks at Caribbean cultural productions such as cricket and carnival as hermeneutical practices of resistance. So my work, my PhD work was on Junkanoo, and it's the same thing. Something is going on in our cultural practices that critique and resist injustices that are colonial and that we have inherited. So for Thomas, carnival and cricket provide insight into the Caribbean use of place for resistance and subversion. They bring social struggle into the public display, providing accessible ways of critiquing, questioning, and contesting unvoiced realities. We have other Caribbean thinkers like George Mulrain, who's Trinidadian, who talks about vernacular hermeneutics. And for him, it involves the use of historical and critical methods, which biblical students would know very well, to understand the original context of the Bible, the interpretive lens of the reader and his or her community context, and the interaction between the Bible and the lived experience of Caribbean people. We will never read the Bible the same way. We have to engage critically in what was being said, but we don't engage with it as if we were just neutral, unfeeling, unthinking people. We're real people. Michael Jagasaw, who's Guyanese, is another theologian and post-colonial thinker, decolonial thinker, for whom hermeneutics is central in his decolonial work. He employs the pan-Caribbean figure of Anansi to articulate a hermeneutical approach patterned after the trickster figure. In one of his works, he says this: as one whose life has been shaped in the Caribbean, my theology and my theologizing and hermeneutics reflects its Caribbean heritage, especially its rainbow nature. This is one of the reasons why I find it difficult to theologize with a view. Like Anansi, my proclivity is to do theology from multiple points of view. That is, with 8 legs, tapping epics from the cosmic floor. And if you know that Anansi, the trickster spider, evokes a lot of things in us, you know, just imagine this. If you're in a place of injustice and oppression and you have no power, what do you do? How can you deal with it? How can you wrestle with it? You have to get real treacherous to deal with power. There's something that goes on with hermeneutics of resistance in this regard. Recently, I've published something with your own Anna Kasafi Perkins, and we did some research and are publishing part of a volume called Drumversations, where we look at what do drummers do when they're drumming, whether that is in the context of Junkanoo, whether that's in a Rastafarian context or carnival. It's not just drumming that we do. There is a contestation always. And part of that contestation is critiquing colonial forms of Christianity that persists in everyday life. And this is what we said. Such contestations are grounded in a colonized theological aesthetic, which too often rejects beauty in the African form, the body, worship, and play. And perhaps the crucial question of theological aesthetics when accounting for Caribbean concerns is whether and to what extent the Afro-Caribbean person truly reflects divinity. Rastafari and Afro-Christian movements originating in Jamaica presents a response to such contestations, which is still perceived as radical today. The theological aesthetics of Rastafari divinizes the Black person and God because he appears in the form of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. This connection valorizes the African, including African ways of worship, where drumming and chanting are central. There is something that we do, not just in what we say, but how our bodies react, what we beat, our tone of voice, the way we touch, the way we roll our eye, and the way we suck our teeth. You better believe all of that is part of the kind of hermeneutics that is anti-imperial and that is pro-African and pro-African Caribbean. So we make a statement arguing that such aesthetics and hermeneutics are always grounded in African traditional spirituality and pneumatology. It's our contention that theological aesthetics in the Caribbean key, particularly drumming, pounds out rhythms on the heart of God and leads directly to a consideration of the work of the Spirit that liberates. Moving right along, I think we need to pause. And I said a lot of things, but we need to consider the nature of plantation Christianity. And that's a picture of Columbus. Well, one of the images of the fall of Columbus, 1492, on an island of which we now call the Bahamas. And the island was named San Salvador. And the island had a name. The name was Guanahani. And the indigenous of that island was seen as people who can be taken back to Spain as slaves. They would readily become servants, for they had no God. The psychology in this kind of Christianity against indigenous people or Black people or non-white Western people is fascinating. You would have been traveling months on the high seas, got shipwrecked, and your thought in meeting people you never saw before is that you would take some back to be servants. I want somebody to help me make sense of that kind of pathology, because that's what I would call that. I often argue that the version of Christianity that came to the region must be seen through psychological lenses. A Christianity that engenders such violence and destruction and acts in unempathetic ways can only be framed as what I call psychopathological. Your own scholars like Orlando Patterson was the first to offer the thesis that plantation society was very much a non-society. Slavery was a total institution. And the chief purpose of the colonies was for profit, and profit going back to the center, back to Europe. And this was not a region in which you have children, in which you retire, in which you have a pension. This was a region in which if you were Black or indigenous of the Americas of some kind or the other, you were destined to an early death by being worked to death, brutalized, raped, and killed. These were factories, according to Patterson. And the role of the church, particularly the Planters Church, was to ensure that the system remained precisely calibrated. But I want to highlight another scholar of yours who is increasingly becoming important for me. This is Frederick Hickling, who explores the psychological lens in his Cycles of Elmina, healing our memories, overcoming the wounds of our history. And he makes a number of assertions. Firstly, we must theorize African Caribbean life psychologically in light of the event of the enslavement. What it was a psychological process that continues to reverberate in the present lives of the region. And secondly, European white supremacy is a psychological process, a kind of psychosis. And part of this psychosis is the deep belief that people of color and indigenous inhabitants of the rest of the world are subhuman, only slightly superior to domestic animals. And thirdly, this psychosis and the cycles of psychopathology affect every aspect of Black and African Caribbean life. He writes, there is a growing evidence from psychiatry, psychology, sociology, economics, and anthropology that the ravages of African enslavement, of the African slave trade, have profoundly affected the thinking, feeling, and behavior of African people at home and abroad. Everyone's been damaged by this. He argues further that, and what is relevant to this, what I'm saying is the destructive nature of European colonization through Christianity and Islam have always had to contend with African traditional religions and philosophy. While they have been called pagan or primal, they pre-existed European Christianity by millennia and are difficult to eradicate. Just a thought as we think about the church today. I just have a provocative picture. I'm Anglican, so let me find a good Anglican picture. But a number of theologians make the point that, you know, how to what degree have we become self-sufficient in our hermeneutics? How enculturated have we become? Two persons, Cartwright Davis, um, Antigan, Noel Erskine, I think Antigan. Please forgive me, Cartwright. But Noel Erskine, definitely Jamaican. They make similar points. There have been 4 levels of enculturation. For Davis, the church has moved from the church and the people to a church for the people to a church of the people, but it hasn't really, really, really in its depth become the people's church. There are still too many ties to another region, space, and time. Erskine says there's a church as friend of plantocracy, church as friend of the Black people, church and the Black experience, but it has not fully become the church as the bearer of our identity. We still refer somewhere else. Let's move on to talk about healing and wholeness, because I don't just want to talk about hermeneutics, and my time is running short, but I want to talk about something that Jamaicans would know very well, and those within the Anglophone African Caribbean. So in the English-speaking Caribbean, we should know about Maya. If we talk about Sam Sharp and Bob Marley, we are talking about Mayalist spirituality that undergirds them. It is a spirituality that is both.
I need to sit down and have a sausage. I can't go home like this.
It is a spirituality that is both critical and resistant to the oppressor. This is the beauty of it. At the same time, it affirms and heals the oppressed. And if we lose sight of this, we lose sight of one of the greatest strengths of the region. So I have Diane Stewart there, who is also one of yours, and you, an amazing scholar. But when we interrogate the Mayalist tradition further, we come to see that it is fundamentally about wholeness. In the context where you are denied as a human being, what keeps you whole? Stewart traces the trajectory of nihilism in Jamaican religiosity and culture, arguing that there is a systematic renewal of the culture towards wholeness. Beneath a history of vilification and suppression, nihilism transforms into various cultural traditions and experiences, including Native Baptist, revivalism, Kumana, Rastafari, and dancehall. And there is an impulse within African traditional religions and the African Caribbean plantation society to consistently remember the self. There is a deep sense that we are always being remembered, being made whole. In theology, we call it anamnesis. This is what Jesus does. This is my body given for you. He is remembering himself, the past, and this history of salvation. And this remembering for Stuart happens through the 6 essential features of Jamaican slave spirituality that shape both Sharp's thinking, Marley's thinking, all in the English-speaking Caribbean, all of our thinking. There is a communal theism, that there is a Godhead, but God is expansive and venerated through deities and invisible beings. We are caught in a psychological split always because we want to talk like Europeans, but we believe in the world of spirits and we feel something and we have vibes. You know, British people don't speak like this. But we see God in particular ways, but we don't affirm this. Ancestral veneration. What do we do with our elders? Our sense of our history, connectedness. possession and trance and mediumship. That's fundamentally part of who we are, but it's been demonized. Food offering and animal sacrifice. Sorry, divination and herbalism. We are people who know the sea and we know the land and we know about healing more than most. And finally, neutral mystical power. Then as an aspect of life in which we have agency to bring about transformation. And it is mystical and unseen. How do we bring this into our hermeneutical practices and our consciousness? And the act of remembering, of healing the soul of the oppressed and brutalized is something that Hickling talks about and takes seriously. And I really wish we would do this in everyday Christian practices, in the way we read the scriptures. So Stuart says Rastafari emerged in Jamaica in the early 20th century as an antidote to the delusional European ideology, using the psychological mechanisms of negation and encapsulations, and has resulted in an antithetical psychological and cultural formation that has swept the world. So Bob don't just stay in Jamaica. Rastafari doesn't just stay enclosed in your land. It moves across the world against every opposition. And there is something healing about it. I wanted to get into some Bob York music. But just as a quick, I remember listening to Babylon System. Bob Dangerous. Babylon System is the vampire sucking the children day by day. But listen to the words, read it. But the Babylon System is the vampire, falling empire, sucking the blood of the sufferers, building church and university, deceiving the people continually, graduating thieves and murderers. Look how they suck in the blood of the sufferers. What imagery that is. And we can dance to it and cool out it and chill out. But this is top-notch, decolonial, anti-colonial critique of empire, but done in a way that is so healing and inspiring. Just look in Jump Naya Bingi, another one of Bob's songs I really like. But just look at the words. I love to see when you're dancing from within. It gives great joy to feel such sweet togetherness. Everyone's doing and they're doing their best. This is liturgical. And it reminds I of the days in Jericho. What happens in Jericho? When we trodden down Jericho walls, they march around 7 times. And how do they defeat? Through praise and worship, not warfare. These are the days when we trod through Babylon. Gonna trod until Babylon falls. Deep biblical imagery. What do you make? These things are present in the culture. How do we esteem them, learn from them, and recreate the kinds of Christianities that we have? One of the final things I want to end in this an idea of lament, a deeper look at Caribbean hermeneutics that are decolonial takes lament seriously, lament and healing. You see, lament is there throughout the musical tradition, but it's also there in the time of crisis. In the region, we suffer from hurricanes significantly, and hurricanes or any kind of natural disaster is not just about what happens to the land. Cartwright Davis talks about the hurricane, the different hurricanes in the region. And some of you may remember Hurricane Gilbert in 1988 that devastated Jamaica, or the oil crisis in Trinidad and Tobago in the mid-1980s. He states, such is the nature of the Caribbean landscape. The three experiences described, Hurricane Gilbert, economic collapse, and political upheaval, portray the realities endemic in the region. The rapid shift of promise and regression have been frequent in much of Caribbean life. But he wrote this before the earthquake in Haiti in 2010 that I remember quite well, which brought Haiti back into international political and theological conversation. The earthquake, this time, it was unspeakable. The catastrophe, unspeakable. But on my screen, you have Pat Robinson. And I don't know if you remember this. There's Pat Robinson, there's Bob Marley, and we're talking about hermeneutics. Elizabeth McAllister, who studied what had been happening in the kind of anti-voodoo, anti-Black rhetoric within this particular evangelical contingent, talks about what Pat Robinson said on the 700 Club. Now, the 12th of January 2010 killed an estimated 300,000 people, making it the worst disaster in the history of the Americas. The next day, Robinson on the 700 Club on CBN said that the earthquake could be best understood by a little-known event that people might not want to talk about. Haitians were cursed, he said, because they long ago swore a pact to the devil. This is what he said. Something happened a long time ago in Haiti, and people might not want to talk about it. They were under the heel of the French, Napoleon III and whatever. And they got together and swore a pact to the devil. They said, we will serve you if you get us free from the prince. True story. So the devil said, okay, it's a deal. And they kicked the French out. Ever since, they have been cursed by one thing after another. How do you interpret a catastrophe in this way? But this is the kind of thing that what happens if we imbibe it ourselves? But on the other hand, you have people like Bob. A good place to go would be Carolyn Cooper's reflections on Bob Marley's music and how it functions lyrically and aesthetically. He uses biblical allusion, symbolism, proverbs, rhythms, aphorism, metaphor in his artistry. He employs a range of melodic and liturgical and poetic and literary devices, all steeped within African Jamaican cultural heritages. He is prolific with his use of the Psalms and other parts of the Hebrew Bible, or his allusions to Babylon, or the deep desire for redemption across his music. For Cooper, Bob Marley's chant against Babylon is both medium and message. Babylon is described as the oppressive state, the formal social and political institutions of Anglo-American imperialism. And what becomes clear is that Marley's music functions prophetically and apocalyptically. It contests empire, but is there to heal the oppressed and the downtrodden, not scapegoat them through hermeneutics, calling them the devil, or making pact with the devil, or calling them cursed. The music and lyrics simultaneously are ways of facing the pain of trauma while fighting the oppression that is pervasive. And there's much I can say about the prophetic tradition, but let me just conclude from what I've explored above. It becomes clear that liberation, emancipation, and affirmation are not separate desires, not for Jamaica, not for the rest of the region. Decolonization is not simply a political or theological event. This ain't just about politics. It is psychological and existential. It's about how we think about what we think. And theological hermeneutics in the region continue the three-part function of resisting violence and oppression, using political subversion and critique. You have to critique the kinds of things that damage your society. It might be the leadership. And finally, it affirms the identity and the image of God within the African person. If your biblical hermeneutics don't lead you to state that every human being is made in the image of God, then what kind of hermeneutics are you doing? It ain't godly, and it's certainly not Jesus type. Following work Anna Perkins and I have done, I suggest that Caribbean theological hermeneutics naturally possesses a pneumatology that is revolutionary. We have to transform how we think, how we interpret texts, and we need to look seriously at what we've inherited and ask big questions. And we have to see what we have always had all along, powerful and beautiful in their manifestations. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner, for a riveting lecture that focused on the lasting legacy of imperial hermeneutics. And as a Caribbean people, our quest to engage in a hermeneutic that liberates us, emancipates us, and affirms our identity in a wholesome way as we confront the realities of us as a people of moral violence, natural violence, trauma-filled past and present, and seeing how our hermeneutical practices can help us as a region to overcome such maladies. We want to give God thanks, and we want to thank Dr. Turner for this wonderful lecture this afternoon. And I'm going to decrease in my speech right now and open the floor for meaningful conversation with Dr. Turner in the next 5 minutes or so. If you have questions or comments regarding what Dr. Turner has presented to us this afternoon, I welcome those comments and I welcome those questions right now as we continue this very relevant, salient, and important conversation on the matter of how we do hermeneutics within the African Caribbean community. I see Dr. Duncanson's hand is raised, and I'm going to give him the floor now to ask his question. Go ahead, Dr. Duncan. Go ahead. The mic is open. You know that he's having some audio issues there that we have been facing all evening. But as we wait on Dr. Duncan to put his question.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, I have had trouble unmuting my mic.
Okay.
So thank you. I just want to thank you for this. I'm teaching a historical introduction to historical theology to master's students in public theology, and they're supposed to be in class today, but can't think of a better summary of what we're trying to do in historical theology to get away from those dominant Western themes. I'm wondering, and I guess my question then is a twofold question. I have a question about that. It really is a question about dialogue and how do we bring the dialogue with that tradition, the tradition that I was raised in theology, the Western tradition, into conversation with the tradition that you're speaking of, and some of the work that I do as well. I do work with Rastafari as well. So I'm just curious of how we do that, and then we do that. I'm in Canada. I'm teaching at Jamaican Theological Seminary over Zoom. You're in the UK, there's other people in Nigeria. And so I'm interested in that a little, if you could say a little bit more about how that, the globalization of that type of hermeneutic, how you see that really helping the global church.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Duncanson, I honestly wish we we could remake the world and dialogue would be welcomed. But I think we have to break down a whole lot of power and an imbalance of power within, formal structures of theology. Certainly in the UK, I feel things like Black theology are marginalized. Um, I think it's changing as more people from the non-Western world write and take us specific places, but that seems slower than we would like. But also, I think honestly, we have to seriously invest in in this kind of dialogue you envision. We have to invest in new kinds of thinking, new kinds of scholarship, and we have to invest in new kinds of decolonial thought. But that it has to come from somewhere. That's the point. Um, and I don't know, it's all of us together. That's hard work. So
Well, you can sign me up.
me too.
So much. Dr. Duncanson Hales, he's one of our adjunct lecturers there, located in Canada, teaching master's in public theology program here at the Jamaica Theological Seminary. As you heard him, they're having wonderful times in that course and really responding to the clarion call that Dr. Turner has laid down for us today. Any other questions or comments for Dr. Turner? I see in the chat as I wait there. This is Sandra. Go ahead, Sandra Maxwell Williams. I was going to read your comment, but since your hand is
Thank you. Excellent presentation, Dr. Turner. Very thought-provoking, and it touched on so many different aspects of who we are, where our literature, our dance, and everything just comes together for our wholeness. And as you spoke, I reflect currently on what is happening in Catholicism in Jamaica. So many of our priests are from Africa, from Nigeria, from so many other places. And I think to the history of the church where it sent missionaries out to Africa, and now within the African space, there are so many vocations to the priesthood. And what I find here in the representation in Jamaica is that African flavor is now coloring, pun intended, is coloring the Jamaican church in such a wonderful way that is, I think, in a way, bringing a little bit of wholeness to almost like we're coming home to. So it's a very excellent, and there's so many opportunities for just exploration of who we are. I am not a theological student, by the way, but it brings together so many things. So thank you, very excellent. It's in fact, I think it's a bit of a healing this evening to just understand all the parts of us coming together in a practical way with our faith, with who we are, and not denying any part of ourselves. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thank you. I didn't know this about what's going on in Jamaica, but I would like to learn more. But thank you very much.
Fair enough. Some would say that this conversation is an academic conversation, meaning it is located in the Academy of the Caribbean, Jamaica Theological Seminary, halls of the United Theological College of the West Indies there. But we're not seeing this transition into the local church, the local community. How do we get those who are being trained at the seminary or within the seminary as pastors to go into their local churches and congregations and pretty much swim against the tide because of what is deeply entrenched in the psyche of us.
Oh boy, that's a big one because I face that all the time. I train priests in the Church of England. I also do some teaching at Codrington College in Barbados, and it's difficult no matter how all you can do is sow, like the biblical imagery of sowing and reaping. You have to have that mindset. I have to do my best to sow. God gives the increase. But I need to make sure that I'm sowing for the future and for growth. And but you're right, the tide, oh Lord, the tide is strong. Just concretize ways of thinking that don't help, models that are antiquated. And you talk about it's in the academy, this thinking, this learning. And maybe that might break down with technology, in the future to some degree. But as the gentleman said earlier, dialogue, like you need to have kind of educational teaching and praxis that is dialogical. It doesn't just stay in the academy. It's I'm a practical theologian, so I'm interested in practices, not just thinking, but how we transform the concrete context. And I think with a lot of prayer and consistent sowing and a lot of wisdom, we can make changes. But the reality is it's not easy. And it's just admitting that reality.
Robust conversation here at the Jamaica Theological Seminary, the annual Clive Afflick lecture. And we are hearing from the Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner as we look at hermeneutical practices that promote wholeness within the African Caribbean community. We are wrapping up, but we have two more questions or comments to take. We have from our own lecturer here at JTS, full-time member of faculty, Ms. Erica Campbell. Will take her question and comment, and then finally we hear from Jeremy, and then we'll wrap it. Campbell?
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for the lecture. Much appreciated. I noticed that you drew on thinking and practices that many would deem antithetical to Christianity, right? How do you propose that we critically engage with these ideas? And do you think that there are any objective standards by which we can evaluate Caribbean thought as well as European thought? And I'm not going to talk.
Oh, I know someone was gonna give me a heavy question like this, but thank you. I, thank you. That's an awesome question. I think the first one for me is how do you engage with dialogue with these things considered antithetical? I think I'm always thinking antithetical to what exactly? Because when I trace Christian history, we have this notion of orthodoxy, but really how orthodox is this orthodoxy? And what is there within the Christian tradition itself? So for as much as we might marginalize and vilify, um, say in Jamaica, the kind of Mayalist traditions, I would say Jesus, just look at the kinds of Christianities that came. They ain't look nothing like Jesus, and ain't nothing orthodox about them. But I think it's just honestly looking at each um and in their own right and learning from. And then if we remember when we historicize Christianity properly, it ain't European and it ain't Western in origin, and we know this. Um, but that other part, which is a tougher question, the one about is there an objective standard? Personally, I think the standard for me is justice. and that which proposes and tends towards life. Because destructiveness, psychopathology happen everywhere. You know, it happened in the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, whatever, and missionary Christianity. We could perpetuate the same cycles. But I think if we think about what is as much as possible just for all, and that preserves life, I think that is more objective, if there is even such a thing. That's what I would be working towards. I hope that answers your very tough question. Thank you very much.
Jerry, go ahead.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I am Jeremy. I'm a first year student. But I'm listening to you carefully, and there are some thoughts going through my mind. Some thoughts going through my mind. One of them is, we look at the scriptures as what the Almighty God would present as what He would want every people, every social status of people, every historical background of people is aligned to a common goal and understanding. How do we remain consistent with the scriptures, disregarding cultural differences? How do we remain true to the scriptures in spite of the social background we are from, or the racial background we are from, and so on? How can we ensure that the truth of the scriptures is maintained throughout?
All right. Jeremy, you said you were first year, and I think as you continue in your training, I want you to buckle up because it's gonna get rough. And I don't mean to make light of it, but I think the truth is there are some fundamental things you say that I'd have to ask you to think about. Firstly, is there one perfect way of interpreting the scriptures? And we have to admit there is no one way. And the scripture itself is extremely complex and often contradictory in some places. Let me give you a good example of this that you will have to wrestle with. In the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are the historical documents that are written so that we understand something about Jesus's life. But the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have Jesus going to Jerusalem once. John has Jesus going 3 times. Like, what's going on there? Which one is right? But then we have to step away and realize that all of them are doing a kind of interpretive exercise. It doesn't mean that there is no Jesus. It just means that the reflections on Jesus differ. But if we understand that, we can make some wise choices. And I think for now, there's so much more I can say, but for now, I would say when reading scripture, we have to be very careful to read wisely, broadly, and critically. But again, according to the lecture, be very, very suspicious of how we come to it in the first place, how we're framing it. And this is what I would challenge you. Ask yourself, why am I even asking this question? But we could go on, that's all day. Sorry, Jeremy, if that doesn't answer your question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner. What a way to end this time of conversation dialogue, as Dr. Donaldson Hale said earlier, with Dr. Turner, as we seek to unpack what he has presented to us in the lecture earlier. Listen, if you want to listen to that lecture Once more, you may want to check out the Love 101 social media platforms such as Facebook, I believe, YouTube, JTS. Subsequent to this broadcast, will also upload the lecture on its YouTube page. And if you are in-house at the seminary, you may want to request the lecture from our IT department, Mr. Clive Blake, Mr. Misha Montgomery will ensure that you get this recording. I will be doing so because there's so much to chew on that Dr. Turner has presented to us today. We're going to have the vote of thanks now from one of our grad students who is in our master's in biblical studies program. He is a member of the Portmore Missionary Church. We're going to have Miss Tashana Wellington give the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Reverend Beckford. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the organizing committee, I am honored to extend the vote of thanks for the annual Clive Afflick Memorial Lecture. Firstly, we give God thanks for the opportunities that he has afforded us this afternoon. Without him, this would not have been possible. To our distinguished guest presenter, Dr. Carlton Turner, your insights have left us deeply inspired and enriched. Our hermeneutical lens have been shifted, and the adjustments will now challenge the colonial narratives as Caribbean people. Sincere gratitude to Love FM for their exceptional support in streaming the events on their social media platform and broadcasting live on radio. Your partnership has been instrumental in reaching a broader audience, adding to the success of this event. Special thanks to our president, Dr. Winston Thompson, for graciously hosting this event. Sir, your unwavering support and commitment to academic excellence has created an environment where meaningful discussions like these can flourish. Additionally, a special thanks to the JTS administration. I also want to acknowledge the technical team, even though we started out on a little glitch. Nevertheless, we thank you, Mr. Clive Blake and Mr. Kavon Edwards, for your expertise this evening and for also monitoring our online space. I also want to thank our moderator, Reverend Richard Beckford. Thank you for your flawless navigation of this evening's program, adding to its success. Lastly, but by absolutely no means least, thank you to our audience, those of you who joined us via Zoom, radio, or whatever social media platform you chose. Without your presence and participation, this event would not have been as impactful as it was. Thank you all again for making this lecture a resounding success. Do have yourself a wonderful evening and God bless you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wellington, for the thank yous. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dogs and cats, sister and dog and brother and auntie, thank you so much for joining us here at the Jamaica Theological Seminary annual Clive Afflick lecture, where we had the Reverend Canon Dr. Carlton Turner exploring the theme, hermeneutical practices that promote wholeness in the African Caribbean context. We are so grateful that you joined us this year. We look forward to the ongoing dialogue along these lines of hermeneutics. My friends, until we speak again, meet again, talk again, walk with God bless.